If there aren't, if there aren't any yet, I would just a simple question of clarification, or the point where I perhaps didn't quite follow. So, why does good have to be immediate? The recognition of good has to be immediate. When the point where I think you, as I understood, you repeated Kant's argument that any mediation in self-justification, any questioning, any attempt to justify yourself is a proof of evil. So why is this immediacy? Or in what sense?
I don't know that I wanted to say exactly what you just you said. I mean, I think there's an articulation of our understanding of what we're doing as good to do, which can be given in general terms, and I get there various such, as well, doctrine of virtue is an articulation of those various ways. So, as I said, why are you doing this and then the other? Why are you, as we're skipping the party and going over to X? Well, he's in a bad state. I need to comfort him. Now this reveals what I'm doing to be good to do. I was only saying this shouldn't be misunderstood as meaning that the goodness resides in the conformity of what I'm doing to a certain general description. Maybe comforting my friend. This cannot be because there are limitable ways in which what I'm doing may still be bad, even though it conforms to this description. And now the question came up as how is it that I can know that I'm acting well? This is so important that that the good from which we act must be good that we know as such. I mean, this is where the animal acts according to its principle, but does not have, as it were, knowledge of its principle. It has a sensory consciousness of its agreement or disagreement with its principle in pleasure and pain. That I'm taking. This is Kantian or Aristotelian thought, which I'm now using, but I think it's sound. But it has no knowledge of its principle. There's to say no consciousness that has the generality of its principle. And so there's knowledge of the good, and this is now this comes to be extremely difficult. I mean, how do I know that I have acted well? Insofar as this knowledge is not limitable to knowledge that what I was doing conformed to a certain description. This will never be enough. And so there's a sort of a deepening of the demand. I mean, the point is in this understanding of our principle as the good, as we're opened up to the whole, it's some weird. It's really so, I don't know. So I'm sorry. I'm getting really excited about this because so if you consider the step as we're from the animal to the human being. I spoke of the wider context. This is a term of Thompson's. In the animal, you consider its behavior in terms of its wider context. Its wider context is its life form. That is the totality of its operation that that are related to each other as means to ends in such a way as to sustain themselves. This is sort of its life form, and you can understand any bit of behavior insofar as it's a manifestation of the animals being alive through this wider context. And this is a certain limited content, whereby you can distinguish one life form from the other. Now what takes this position here is exploded. And so my principle is no longer limitable in this way. And this is the the defining character, I think, of ethical thought, is where this, and also makes it so difficult to see that I'm as well governed by something that is not in this way nature.
Okay. Microphone. Greg.
So thank you. This was very interesting. Quite excited. I think I have basically two comments or questions.
Yeah.
One relates to Spinoza, who I think is your primary interlocutor in the question with natural goodness. You cite the example of fox eating something that is bad for the fox, but I think who you are really quoting is Spinoza, who is using the example of God telling Adam not to eat the fruit of that tree because it is bad for you. And it is only Adam who misinterprets this as a kind of a command, as a kind of a law, and puts into this, which is simply a matter of what is naturally good for Adam. Adam misunderstands this as a kind of a moral obligation. But I might come back to Spinoza, to play a little bit the devil's advocate. But I want to jump first to what I think is more central to your argument, which is toward the end of the talk when you were talking about forgiveness. You specifically quoted a difference between your position and Kant's position. Yeah. But I'm afraid Kant's, at least to me, sounds more convincing, and I'll explain why. Because Kant's position, which you I think elegantly phrased as, only God can see the heart, and you say that no, because if only God saw our heart, then we could. I mean, basically asking for forgiveness from another person would not make any sense. And then you go into saying that basically if the other person forgives us, that she, already annihilates the evil in me to an extent. But if she rejects the forgiveness, and this is what I want to talk about, she condemns us. And if this is so, if the refusal to give forgiveness is condemnation, then wouldn't a person who refuses to forgive basically commit an evil act, basically show itself as evil? And if that is so, well, isn't asking for forgiveness even more evil? Because if you ask someone to forgive you, knowing that they cannot possibly reject you, otherwise they would of course have committed an evil act, then aren't you forcing them already to show you mercy? Aren't you actually just committing another evil act by asking for forgiveness? And I think this is specifically the problem you get, and not Kant. Because for Kant, it is not, in the ultimate analysis, it is not another person who you are asking for forgiveness. It has to be some big other. It has to be God that you ask for forgiveness. I think this is only, for Kant, there is no contradiction in this. Whereas in your logic, I'm not sure that there isn't.
Well, I don't know whether I'm prepared to enter Kant in depth. I think Kant's philosophy is a philosophy of despair, ultimately. But I want to say, in any case, why I think the problem you described doesn't exist for me, or as I think is not right. You are completely correct. She, whom I ask for forgiveness, if she rejects her forgiveness, and I said that explicitly, condemns herself. Yeah. This is because in rejecting my asking her for forgiveness, in rejecting my plea for forgiveness, she asserts herself to be good. She asserts her capacity to sit in judgment over me and declare me to be evil. And the argument before then was supposed to show that there can be that alleged self-knowledge of myself as good is itself a most thorough proof, as it were, of my evil. So that's right. Now you said, from this follows that I put her, as it were, in a really bad predicament, yeah, because she cannot reject my plea for forgiveness. I sort of force her into it, sort of pressure her into forgive me. Actually, to say, so, if you don't forgive me, then you're fucked. But it seems to me that this is to conceive the entire, or the form of thought of the good on the basis of law, and not on the basis of spirit. Through the form of spirit. Through the letter and not through the spirit. Yeah. There is for my asking her for forgiveness is already, and that is, as it were, the work of the Spirit, if I put it this way, the idea of her that I have as fully good. There's no question that so if I ask for forgiveness, I do not, in the same thought, calculate, how good is she? What would she do? Was she good or was she bad? And so, on the contrary, the point is if I this opening of the heart is only possible in the very thought that she whom asks for forgiveness is fully good. So it's already there. But at the same time, I know that she must. It's not that she must forgive me. This is the same. She's completely free. For I know I am evil. So why wouldn't she say that? Yeah? Why wouldn't she judge? This is me, and this is the thought that constitutes asking for forgiveness. And if it in any way diverges from this, it is not what it pretends to be. Asking for forgiveness. If it is some calculation, she's really also, she's not so good herself, right? So she shouldn't really come down on me so hard because this is not, we are outside. So there's this one thought in which I know I'm evil, open my heart to her, and therein know herself to be my judge, and that is know herself to be good, unmixed and unaffectable. So you have to have always, in this, this is what I, in this act of forgiveness, there's always, as were the most thorough identity of the opposing terms, as were the knowledge of my evil is my knowledge of her goodness. It's the same. So that kind of thought that you were imputing, as were possibly figuring in the thought of the one who asked for forgiveness, is distorting. It's already, as well, making it something other. But I want to say a last word. I didn't dare to say this. I have a last sentence to this talk which I didn't read. But you said only God can forgive. I know, according to Kant, and that seems a good thing. And I have to say I agree. But so I was trying to describe the nexus of forgiving as a nexus of individual to individual, and in this idea of individuality is, as it were, captured the impossibility of thinking of the other through the idea of particularity, of just special features, but sort of being herself illimitable. So it's the relation of whole to whole, if it's a one-self relation of the whole. And in this nexus, I said there is knowledge of the illimitable efficacy of the good. For there's knowledge of the annihilation of the good. I argued for this. I mean, that she who forgives knows that the bad is gone, and I who am forgiven know it is gone, and this is the liberation, the sort of absolute freedom. That's in this. And so it is knowledge of the actuality of the good precisely as illimitable. And therefore I say, I read the last two sentences, this nexus is the actuality of the highest and the whole. I said, add being forgiven, and forgiving is being forgiven by God. So I do not want to say that there is a further thing to be added here. God, if we think through the nexus of forgiving, this is the actuality of what I first introduced as the highest and the whole. This is it. Now, if I want to put this in the place, of God, which is left out, that would be bad.
Can I pressure you even further on this point? I'll try to be very brief. It's just that even the very act of asking for forgiveness, especially in the circumstances that you described, is basically inflicting on the other, on her, some enormous duty. And isn't that, in a way, treating her as your object, as something that you needed? You needed to have the forgiveness for your own personal reasons. Isn't it inflicting on her something?
I understand that. I want to insist that. So I want not to let go of this, as were, togetherness of opposites. That is, I, in asking for forgiveness, do not know. Especially, I don't know that she must forgive me. In a certain sense, on the contrary, it's absolutely necessary that we have, that we understand this nexus of forgiving as not itself, as it were, looked down upon from, as it were, a higher position. It must be thought from the inside on each term, and it's thought on each side in, as it were, in a certain sense, opposing way. Yeah, so that you cannot conjoin it, as it were, in one thought that was not itself that opposition, and you cannot look down upon it. Yeah. So, in asking for forgiveness, I do not think she must forgive me. I especially don't think that, she is ethically required to forgive me, something like that. Yeah, that thought is completely absent from asking for forgiveness. On the contrary, because I open my heart and know therein that there's no excuse. I was imagining that situation. There's no excuse. I stop making excuses for myself and ask for forgiveness. That's the transition. So I say there is no excuse. It lies with me. I have no excuse. I mean, you may find excuses, but if you find excuses, you do not see the depth of my troubles. Yeah. And so I do not think that she must forgive me. Yeah. That's of a description from outside my plea for forgiveness. I wanted to say something about the tree of knowledge. Yeah, that's extremely interesting, and of course, all of this will be possible to articulate as an interpretation of that scene. I'm not quite convinced of your interpretation. I would have a different one.
That was Spinoza's.
Okay, Spinoza's. Yeah, sorry. That's so great. And no, Spinoza is my interlocutor, but I just know too little of him to be responding well. That's too lack.
Just use your fox and replace it with
I know, but so there's the knowledge in question here is knowledge of good and evil. Yeah. I think, perhaps it's the same. I would need to read Spinoza and be clear, but I think there is a kind of transition by which, the eating of the apple is one by which, perhaps this is, so far I can agree, by which natural goodness is rejected. It's a sort of a transit. Therefore, it's the raising of good and evil to knowledge, and that means, and this is how it is described, that Adam and Eve become like God. Yeah, well, that's what God says, and this sort of gives rise to this. What I was trying to say in the beginning, there's this absolute discrepancy, between, as it were, my individual being and the, as it were, idea of the principle that is the whole. Yeah, and that's in the latter, I'm like God. Yeah, so that yields the impossibility of, as it were, the form of reconciliation as it were, of good and bad that we have, as it were, in natural goodness, where we can, as it were, subsume the bad under the good and say it's really also, in its way, good. The pain of the fox is good, right? It's of course a consciousness of badness, but this consciousness of badness is itself good, whatever. And there are people who speak in this way about, knowledge of the good. Say, okay, if you know yourself to be evil, that's already show you're fine. It's all right. Yeah. But that cannot be accepted from the first-person point of view. And this is like, I don't know. So yeah. So I would need to, I think, further about it. But I think, right, eating the apple is rejecting any the applicability of an idea of goodness that would be natural. Yeah. It's known goodness now, and it's thus no longer natural.
First of all, I would like to thank you for your lecture. I was thrilled because I always wondered where it would go, and luckily it ended with Hegel. So you said that it's a Lutheran. It's a Lutheran lecture. Not in letter probably, but since you ended with Hegel, it definitely must be in spirit.
Yeah.
So at the end, with the theme of forgiveness, you gave your interpretation of das Böse und seine Verzeihung, which is a kind of negative recognition. I recognize you. In recognizing me, we recognize you mutually each other, but in a negative way. So we are forgiving each other mutually, and this is the only mode in which the recognition can be successful. Okay, on that I agree. So individually, we are evil. As a spirit, in spirit,
right.
we could overcome evil and be good. So. Right. Good exists only as an overcoming of individual evil. Right. However, I have some problems in the first part. Namely, why precisely are we individually evil? You see, on one occasion, one point, you seem to follow Kant in Religion on Reason Alone, that we are evil only to the extent as we acted on our evil principle. This is one definition. How this is possible is another serious question. And then in other circumstances, you defined evil as not being sure of being good. So if I recollect it correctly, you said, if I did well, I would know. I think that this is too heavy a burden. So if this is being good, then no one can be good, even without bad. Yeah. But even without bad principles. So I don't think that you need this necessary acting on bad principle or evil principle or. I think that these two definitions of being evil, well, do not go each other well.
Well, I thought otherwise. I wanted to recover this passage from St. Paul's letter to the Romans that the law brings out the sin. Right, so that the, as it were, depth of the trouble, the depth of the despair is fully recognized before we can bring forth the way in which it is overcome. Otherwise, if it's less deep, then the overcoming will be less deep. I was thinking that the distinction between letter and spirit, and thus a sort of deepening of the, as it were, idea of ethical requirement. I think that's a real I don't know, historical moment that I recognize. I see nothing like this in Nicomachean ethics, and although it's unclear to me whether Aristotle thinks of ethics as being concerned with the form of natural goodness, that's something that Michael Thompson and Philippa Foot have argued. I'm not sure whether that's right fully, but what is correct is that in Aristotle you see nothing of this form of despair. You see nothing, there's nothing, as it were, unavoidable in our encounter with evil. I mean, I was trying to bring out how the very, as it were, recognition of the depth of the demand, which is not limitable, and thereby, as it were, encompasses our entire being, thus requires purity of heart, which does not require just the understanding that I'm doing this and that and the other, which as it were accords with some law, but rather acquires that I see fully, that I see everything, because I must see everything in order to know that nothing makes bad what I'm doing. I must be, as it were, complete perfect receptivity with respect to what is ethically relevant. And I must see the other fully in order not to hurt her. I mean, I must see the totality of what is significant for the idea of good and bad, and this cannot be limited. And therefore, there's this as it were, the demand itself has exploded on me, and is this, thinking through this as it were, illimitable demand on me, which is in a certain way, what I've inflicted on me when I ate from the tree. I recognize myself to be evil. So there's nothing contingent, nothing accidental about this. It is the thinking through of the good itself. And this is how I understand St. Paul saying the law brings out sin. It's as well through the law that this is how St. Paul defends the law. Why is the law there? Because it brings out sin, and it's only through our knowledge of this sin that we can, as well, be forgiven, and so on and so forth. So this is the kind of trajectory I was trying to trace.
But if I may just
sure, please.
If I did well, I would know. If this is the Lutheran. This is completely opposition, because only by faith you can be saved. But faith is grace of God, and you cannot be certain of it. So, if you're certain you're among the saved, you're doomed. So
I don't know. That's difficult. I mean, we can now enter into exegesis of Luther, but I think. So I didn't want to reconstruct everything about Martin Luther, actually, but I wanted to bring out some, as well, motives and as well that I could recover, as well, philosophically. But I think I understand him as saying that in the faith of God, I have certainty of being forgiven. There's no, and it is in and through that certainty that I'm free. And I was seeking to describe the freedom, the liberation, the absolute liberation. In the act of forgiving, this is for me as of the, I don't know, if anything, the most convincing part of this. I mean, that there, and it's marvelous that there's this possibility of annihilation of the past. It's over. I just make it nothing. It's not there's no scar. As Hegel says, the wounds of the spirits heal without scar. This is the power of forgiveness, no scar. And this certainty of being forgiven, that is, I think, what faith is. So I don't think that this is in this sense, I think Kant is in opposition to that. Because in Kant, I am totally, I'm constantly and ineradicably in ignorance with respect to whether I am at all making any progress at all towards virtue. I'm struggling all the while, because I know I've this original propensity to evil. That's really I know that. But I also know that there's the good still in me. That's the bad part in Kant. You know, I know that. I mean, this was why I was emphasizing. I know there's nothing left in me, even less taking full possession of me. But Kant doesn't think that. He says, oh, there's still a practical reason. Here, it's in me. It's unaffectable. It's this good principle. It's still operative in me. So I can hope. So, but in this hope, I struggle. You know, but I have no knowledge that anything happens. You know, toward the good. I mean, I may just go. I cannot know this. This is to me. This is. I mean, just impossible to take in. I mean, there's no way to live. I think it's a way to die. I mean, that's why I was objecting to Korsgaard, who is a Kantian, and says, "Well, you must act." So, well, yeah. But under this idea, you know, all action is that in which I despair. So I can't. This is. Sorry, where was I? Yeah. You see. Sorry, I lost it.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it works. Okay. Yeah, it's good.
Okay, I would like to start from the beginning. Where do you draw the definitions of good and evil?
I mean, where do I?
Where from?
Where from? Okay. Where from? Okay. Where from?
Yes.
Excuse me, do you want to go on?
No.
Okay. Where from? Yes, okay. I take my bearing from the idea that in acting, we face the question why we act as we do. This is to say, there is such an idea of a ground on which we act or from which we act. This is a sort of internal character of human action, that there is such a thing. Right? I needn't claim that everything we do is like that, but that within or from within acting, the question arises: why do this? That I take as one of my starting point. Now, when you have this starting point, you see that there's that as well action contains an idea of its own as well justification. That is, of its own being just. It introduces an idea of the right action or the good action, just simply in the question, why this way or that way? This is why I started with practical inference. I started with the idea of doing something on a ground. And this thought of doing something on a ground introduces this distinction of right and wrong. At the same time, it makes this distinction something that is understood and is sort of understood through an idea which, as well, governs practical thought in its totality. Insofar as I think practically at all, that is, insofar as I think about what to do, my thought is governed by an idea of the justice of doing what I, in this thought, determine myself to do. And it is this. So, as with the principle of my action, then enters the discussion here as that which I understand in thinking of doing this and the other because ABC. Right? And this is what gives this idea, this is what gives this principle its peculiar character. As it, if I want to, and it's this, this is what makes it distinct from any principle that may govern animal life. Because the principle of animal life, it's life form, the fox is life form, you know, which as where specifies what is good fox life. Yeah, we can say what good fox action and good fox life is. That is, as I want to call it, a given nature. It's not through its understanding of itself. It's just there, and the fox is, as it were, you know, is that principle, and there's no freedom with respect to it. Yeah, but as with the principle according to which we act, because it is a principle that is contained in thought, is not of that form. It explodes.
Is there an absolute?
Yeah. Well, this is where the idea of absolute comes from. I mean, I think.
Absolute like goodness, or
Yeah.
absolute as a God, as absolute as what? Absolute what?
Well, I mean, if you.
If we go from a certain practical stance, then good and bad, or good and evil, are very subjective, are very contextual. They cannot be possibly absolute.
How do you know that?
How can they be?
Now, how do you know that?
How can they be?
Well, I mean, I'm always only. I do not. And I think my asking you the question was the right move, really, because I mean, I introduced the idea of good not by assuming any kind of knowledge about human beings, but rather in the manner of sort of giving voice to something I understand in doing anything at all.
You yourself said that consoling a friend
Yeah.
in one case
Yeah.
would be a good deed,
Yeah.
but in other, if that would mean
Yeah.
that he would support someone that is not good,
Yeah.
yes, in that
Yeah.
case, it would be bad.
Yeah. That
So
must.
it cannot be possibly absolute good.
No.
So, we cannot
No, on the
say
contrary,
that
that-
consoling a friend absolutely is good. Period.
Exactly. The absolute is a
So
limit.
there is-
No,
how
we.
can you explain absolute?
Yeah. No, I think you misunderstand. That is where the idea of absoluteness. This doesn't mean that I take a limited content, which is obviously not absolute, and then say it's absolute. That's idiotic. Yeah. I mean, that's precisely the point. I mean, if I lay down a certain, set of rules or norms, yeah, and then say, well, acting well is to conform your behavior to those norms. That's nonsense. And that's precisely that in which the absoluteness of the idea of good reveals itself, in the impossibility of, as McDowell said it, codifying it, the impossibility of exhausting it in any set of general statements about what to do. So my knowledge that it is good to do what I'm doing in comforting my friend is not knowledge that my action conforms to this general description. It is knowledge that takes in the whole. That's the difference of letter and spirit. And that precisely is in which the depth of the demand of the good is to be found. Yeah? So it's this doesn't make anything subjective at all, because if I'm acting badly in comforting my friend because I'm hurting someone else in doing so, then this is nothing subjective. I mean, it's nothing that I could myself anyway confine, as were, to a certain opinion. I mean, if I take seriously my own thought of what to do, if I have not always already, as were put in brackets, my own thought, and say, oh my God, well, I think that and the other because probably, I am born in this milieu, and then I think that and the other, and then the social circumstances, blah blah blah. But in this, I think I do not take seriously what I myself think when I think, is this good? Is it good? Am I acting well? No, I have not. No, I have acted badly. Now, what is this? How can I live with that? That I've acted badly. Oh, it's merely subjective. Oh, fine. Okay, good. But yeah, of course you can do that. But this is, I think, itself a form of evading, a form of self-evasion. I would say. I mean, I was not saying you say that, but to me, I cannot do much. Well, perhaps to recapitulate. Precisely, it's the absoluteness of the idea of the good is revealed precisely in the impossibility of giving any limited content that status. That is what the Phariseer do. I don't know. You know this discourse. I mean, people that say, "Oh, I'm very good because I've done all this. I've kept all the laws. You know, I've done this, and now so God will look upon me with grace because I've done all this. That's great. That's precisely wrong. Yeah.
One more question.
Okay. Yeah.
So, is human inherently good or evil?
Oh, good question. Yeah. Well, the answer is, so that was saying, was giving a Lutheran talk. I mean, the answer is that human being is fully evil, completely nothing good in him, and fully good, unmixed, unaffectable in its goodness. That is what man is. I don't know what human beings are. It's the impulse. I mean, the only thing I rejected was a view like Kant's, which has, or at the same time a view like Aristotle's. There are two views here I reject. The one is Aristotle's, who thinks that so the principle of virtue is one that, now I'm interpreting him as Michael Thompson does. So the principle of human virtue is something that human beings naturally are able to satisfy, to fulfill, and even to know that they fulfill. And therefore in Aristotle's ethics, the highest point or the fullness of perfection of virtue is the great-souled man. This great-souled man lives in the certainty of his own virtue and perfects his virtue in, as I want to say, complacency, but Aristotle says his understanding of his own worth. That's one understanding of goodness that I reject. And the other is Kant's, on which there is something in us. This, what is in us, is divine. It is practical reason. It has unaccountably taken abode in this animal body. We don't know why and how. We cannot understand this, but it's there. And this gives us a calling that's different from any animal's calling, because we are called upon to act according to the moral law, and thus have a different kind of principle from that which any animal does. However, we have absolutely no idea that we could possibly achieve virtue. We always must work or must labor under the idea that there is an ineradicable ignorance in us with respect to whether we are good or bad. And I want to say I want to reject both of these. Yeah. Good is transcendence itself. That is what transcendence is. Not speak about good and evil at all. Well, if we become animals, I don't know what this means. I mean, so I was introducing good and evil through the idea of acting from thought. No. See, you must see that it comes with is of nothing other than the self-understanding of acting from thought as such. So and this makes us transcending. That we act from thought. So the idea of transcendence can, as it were, have a foothold only in a being that acts from thought, right? A fox can never transcend itself.
Are there any other urgent questions?
Transcendence.
Alinka, please.
So transcend good and evil.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. I really enjoyed it. I have perhaps some confused reflections or questions, partly related to what Zdravko has had. Or first, I will just try to resume what I understood from what you were saying, namely that in a sense, one can never know the extent is on knowledge if one really acted good or not. Would you agree with this?
Yes. Yes, one can never know this through oneself.
Yes.
As to say, right.
So this is a kind of, I would say, very Kantian position in the sense that precisely, as you put it, because of the infinity of the situation,
Right.
of the circumstances, you
Yeah.
cannot
Yeah.
kind of know. So
Yeah.
it's not a question of knowledge. So as far as ethical realm goes, in relationship to knowledge, you are bound, one is bound, I'm bound to this perpetual questioning or trying to whatever. I mean, the very doubt, the very uncertainty, the very non-knowledge is what I can only know that that I did not act good. That I can only know that. So, and I understand your final solution as a kind of precisely response to this kind of from within Kant in a way, because it kind of breaks with the question of knowledge and simply poses the scene of forgiveness as something completely external to the question of knowing whether one acted good or bad. So is it certainty, is it faith, is it an act which in itself is the goodness of action as such? Or because I really think the whole edifice up to this final moment is extremely Kantian. I think even what you now kind of radicalized Kant, this kind of, it's not simply that the God puts it into us, it's precisely the non-knowledge, the very origin of the something which is not grounded in anything else, but in some kind of human agency, which for Kant is this instance of practical reason. It's the whole argument of it being irreducible to something else is precisely about it's not being deducible or grounded by any kind of natural laws and so on. So there is this interruption which kind of confronts us with this call or whatever one calls it, and then there is this deadlock as you described it, that in a way you can never, I mean, this is also interesting what Zdravko said, that this expression that if I acted good, I would know it. What does this exactly mean? Does it mean that, but this precisely is not possible for human beings? Or does it mean that there are instances where I simply know it? Or is this simply some kind of horizon of exception which constitutes precisely the rest of the field as always evil? So in a way, we can only empirically, we can only act in an evil way, and this is then interrupted by this act of forgiveness. Sorry, I'm a little bit...
No, I don't know whether how well I'll be able to pick up on what you said. It's all interesting, and I want to speak to all of it. I first want to make a short remark on the reason why, according to Kant, we cannot know that we act well, and the reason that I would like to propose for that. According to Kant, as I understand him, the reason is that in order to act well, I need to act from the motive of duty. That is, I need to act exclusively from my recognition that so to act conforms to the moral law. This is, and I can never know that among the sources of determination of my will with respect to a particular action, there wasn't something other than this recognition that so to act was to act according to the moral law. He thereby thinks that he captures the distinction of spirit and letter. He says this in the religion, that this is his. I think his spirit is not spiritual. For him, there's no question of knowing the conformity of a certain way of acting to the law. And the only question there is for him is when I say rather empty question, whether there is, whether the sole motive of my action, the only Triebfeder, was this recognition. As I want to describe it, the source is rather different and is the one you described, namely that it has to do with the determinacy of my action, which is never Kant's concern, as with the particularity or the infinite specificity of what I'm doing. It's sort of absolutely concrete, and therefore has illimitable possibilities of being bad, and therefore requires of me this, what I described as this unoccluded vision. These are all ideas, I think, which are fundamentally un-Kantian, and pose a different kind of difficulty for as well knowing myself to act well. I did want to emphasize in this as well nexus of forgiveness the essential passivity of the actuality of the good. It's being so that also being as well a Lutheran moment, that it's not an act. If I understand knowledge of the good as something in me through which I am capable of realizing that which I know, that is the idea of as well knowledge of the good as efficacious and practical knowledge, and that's the idea I think that Kant has of practical reason. It's a thought of the good that understands itself to be that through which the good is realized. That makes it practical, and in that case, I think there is no acting well that is not as such and through itself the knowledge of itself as acting well. Therefore, now, and this is, I want to say, impossible, and that is a rejection of Kant's notion of practical reason, and rejecting his idea of, as it were, this final idea of the subject as the source of its own goodness, which he also recognized cannot be satisfied, but still that's his ideal point at which to which all his descriptions of our predicament are directed. I want to, destroy this highest point and put in its place something else, namely that passivity that I have in relation to the one who forgives me, where the goodness is received and not done. It's not my act. Does this in any way, communicate with what you were after?
Let me think a little bit more on it.
Okay, I'm sure there are more questions, but we're not exactly early, so I think I propose that we, if necessary, continue this debate in less formal format. Predno zaključimo pa še eno obvestilo, skratka knjige lahko kupite v Azilu po znižani ceni danes, samozavedanje. Poleg tega pa zahvale, da se je ta dogodek in sploh obisk profesora Rödla lahko zgodil, gre do Atriju ZRC in knjigarni Azil, založbi Kratina, Goethe inštitutu, Filozofski fakulteti, Javni agenciji za knjigo in Hergouthskemu društvu Aufhebung. Hvala tudi vam, ker ste prišli in predvsem seveda še enkrat hvala profesorju Rödlu. Thank you again for the lecture.